Good morning. As many of you know, we have a 3-year-old daughter named Lily and a 1-year-old son named Wesley. And we're in the middle of potty training Lily, and so we bought her a little step stool that's collapsible. It's about this big. And when she's not using it, we just set it to the side in the bathroom. And now that Wesley's becoming very mobile, he likes to go exploring throughout the house. And for some odd reason, he's decided that the bathroom is his favorite place in the house to go exploring. And every time he goes in there, he messes with that step stool. And so, as you can probably guess, every time he messes with it, it ends up collapsing. And about half of the time, he gets his finger or his hand pinched in it. And he lets out this really loud, "I'm in pain" cry. And I know all of you as parents, we all know the different cries of our kids. We know when they're tired or when they're hungry, when they're just kind of whiny and want to be held. And we know when they're in pain. And as a parent, when you hear that "I'm in pain" cry, you immediately drop everything that you're doing and you run in and you try to fix the situation. So we pull Wesley's finger or his hand out of the step stool and try to comfort him until he stops crying. Now, this is a very mild example of the topic of today's lesson. Many of you have probably dealt with some much more serious situations with your children or maybe a loved one or someone that you know, where they were in pain or in suffering and you tried to alleviate their pain. But the commonality is that no matter how big or how small the situation, as a parent, it's a natural and innate response to try to alleviate the pain or the suffering of your own child. In other words, it's very easy to show compassion on your own child. Now, compassion is a very interesting word, and to be honest, I don't think I really hear it that often anymore. We hear about sympathy or having empathy for others, but rarely compassion. I guess I view sympathy, empathy, and compassion as kind of a spectrum. So sympathy is kind of equated to pity. We see that someone's going through something and we feel bad for them. But then there's empathy. That's one step further. So we see that someone's feeling is in pain. We feel bad for them. But then we kind of put ourselves in their shoes and we walk through that pain and that suffering and we feel that emotion with them. But then there's compassion, which is one step further. So not only do we see that they're in pain and we feel and we understand their pain and we feel bad for them, and we go through that pain with them, but we take that next step to try to alleviate that pain for them. And so compassion requires action. And again, as a parent, seeing that your child is hurting physically or emotionally brings out that empathy, and it hurts us emotionally maybe more than it hurts the child to see them going through something that hurts them. And as a parent, you'll do whatever you can to alleviate that pain and suffering, which is showing them compassion. Now, the reason why I keep focusing on this from a parent and a child perspective, especially from the father point of view, in my opinion, is because of the following passage that I'd like to share this morning to introduce today's lesson. Psalms 103:13 says, "As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him." Now, this whole psalm is worth reading if you want some encouragement here this morning. But this particular verse really sticks out to me and speaks to me now that I am a father myself. As a parent, you can't not show compassion to your children. And as Christians, we can rest assured that God feels the exact same way about us. No matter how badly we screw up, no matter how much pain we're in, God has compassion for us. And as we continue with our sermon series on the book of John, we find a great example of Jesus' compassion. But in order to fully understand the severity of the situation that this person is in, let's first take a look at an example of Old Testament or Mosaic law. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 22 through 27 says, "If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. If there is a betrothed virgin, and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of the city, and you shall stone them to death with stones, the young woman because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city, and the man because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. But if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor, because he met her in the open country. And though the betrothed young woman cries for help, there is no one to rescue her." Now, what in the world would an Old Testament law have to do with Jesus showing compassion to someone? After all, he only goes around healing the sick, the lame, or the blind, right? Which is something that they didn't choose to have happen to them. As in, Jesus only helped those who made good life choices, but they were just their suffering was of no fault of their own. Now, clearly, that's not the case. You see, there was one time where Jesus was teaching to a crowd of people, and suddenly a group of men show up with a woman, and they place her in the center of everyone. They just tell Jesus that they just caught her in the act of adultery and wanted to know what they should do with her. And as far as what we just read in Deuteronomy, the penalty of adultery is death. So that's pretty clear cut, right? I mean, actions have consequences. She knew what she was doing was wrong, and she did it anyway. How often have we said that about someone in our lives when we hear about something that they did that was wrong? Now, clearly this is a trap, and John alludes to that, because pronouncing a death penalty would have been against Roman law, but forgiving this particular sin would have been against Old Testament law. So the Pharisees are trying to make sure that Jesus is in trouble with someone here. It's either going to be the Romans or it's going to be the Pharisees. When you think about it, the woman in this situation really has nothing to do with this. She's just an object for their devious plans. I'll also mention that Deuteronomy says that both the man and the woman are to be put to death. Now, it's interesting that they only brought a woman before them who was witnessed in the act of adultery. And last I checked, that is a two-person thing that is required. But Jesus doesn't choose a side here. You can imagine the intensity of the situation as all eyes are on the woman first, and then they all turn to Jesus, and he stoops down and he begins to write in the dirt. And after a while, he simply just stands up and says, "Let him who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Then Jesus stoops back down and begins writing in the dirt again. So now where do you think all the eyes in the crowd are? First they were on the woman, then they're on Jesus. Now they're probably on all the scribes and the Pharisees and seeing what their reaction to this is going to be. And instead of any of them throwing a stone, they each begin to leave one by one, starting with the oldest. So instead of choosing a side like the Pharisees wanted, Jesus simply appealed to their conscience, and that appeal won. Now here's the full passage that I'm referencing, which is in John chapter 8, verses 2 through 11. And it's on the screen if you want to double check everything that I've just recounted. Now you might be wondering at this point why it is that I've chosen to share this particular passage this morning. Well, you see, it's been my experience in the Church of Christ, specifically, as I'm just going to talk about what I've seen. I've seen certain sins and certain acts treated as worse than others. Normally, they're either sexual in nature or maybe they are pertaining to marriage. Now, as always, this does not condone sexual sins, and this does not mean that I don't think that marriage is not important. Just ask me afterwards if you want to see how seriously I view these things myself. But I've seen the way that people talk about, they treat, and they look down upon maybe someone who had a child out of wedlock. I've seen people push teenagers to get married because they did something that, quote, only married people should be doing. Seems like kind of a short-sighted decision to push a couple of teenagers into a lifelong commitment. I've seen people be removed from teaching Bible class because it was assumed that they were having a sexual relationship before marriage. Now, notice I said that they didn't know that that was occurring. Nobody witnessed it occurring. It was assumed that it was occurring. And so they were publicly humiliated and told that they were no longer fit to teach a children's Bible class any longer. I've seen the way that people who are divorced are treated, how they're looked down upon, how they're talked about, because clearly they didn't value the sanctity of marriage, or maybe they're just incapable of making a good decision. I've seen people who are on the verge of divorce told not to divorce someone and just persevere through the situation. Remember why it is that you loved him in the first place, even though they had no clue that that spouse was an absolute nightmare and it was an unhealthy living situation now. Meanwhile, we ignore our own sins because they're forgivable and they're what we do, right? They're not as bad. Sure, I might not have been completely honest in my dealings with this other person, but I won the trade. I got what it was I wanted to out of it. Maybe it was just a little bit of gossip. It stayed just between a couple of people, and by the way, it was all true anyway. Sure, I'm a walking headache for everyone else, but they know where I stand with them because I'm brutally honest to the point of being demeaning, and I cause people to cry and be upset every time I have a dealing with them. Drama and conflict follow me wherever I go, but it's never my fault. I've never been the person in the wrong. Maybe I saw someone who was in need of help, but you don't understand. I was in a hurry, and I didn't have time to stop and help them. Maybe it was only 3 or 4 drinks before driving home, but I've had more than that before, and I've been fine driving home. Now, on this list of stuff, I know that I've done some of these things before, and so this isn't me talking down to everyone in here. This lesson was written to me just as much as it's written to everyone else. The point is that all of us sin, and we should all have forgiveness and compassion for others, no matter what it was that led them into that current situation of being in sin. David Guzik's study guide on John 8 says, "In this, Jesus exposed a common sin, the desire to punish the sins of another while ignoring our own sin." As I keep saying, we kind of have this hierarchy of sin built up in our minds, where we have sexual sins or marriage sins at the top of the heap. So oftentimes I see John 8 made out to be about adultery specifically. The reality is that John 8 is about Jesus' compassion and forgiveness, and not specifically about that sin. In fact, let's do a little exercise this morning. I want us all to forget about adultery in this scenario. I want everyone in here to think about the worst sin that you've ever committed, maybe that no one even knows about or you've never talked about. What's the worst thing you've ever done? Let's just give it a second, go back into your mind, and think about it. Now imagine wherever you're at, where this is occurring, the door bursts open and someone walks in and catches you in the middle of it. Or maybe you're having a discussion and someone walks by and they hear exactly what you were just saying. Maybe you're not inside, you're outside, you think you're alone, and suddenly someone appears beside you and catches you red-handed. Now they drag you over and throw you in front of a crowd of people, and they loudly announce what they just caught you doing. You messed up, you know that you deserve punishment, and there's no getting out of this one. So now imagine the feelings that you probably have in this situation. I would imagine there would be a lot of shame, a lot of regret, a lot of anger, a lot of sadness. You know that your reputation at best is ruined. Depending on how illegal what you were doing was, your life may have just been ruined as well. You're completely at the mercy of this guy who's just talking to a crowd of people. And instead of condemning you, he tells everyone else to be the first to cast a stone if they've ever sinned. And as the people slowly leave, you're just left all alone with this man. It's just the two of you. And he looks at you and he says, "Where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," you say. Then the man says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go now and sin no more." So now imagine the feelings that you would have in this situation. You deserved that punishment, but you didn't receive it. You deserved condemnation, but instead you received grace and you received mercy. Imagine the relief that you'd be feeling, and likely the renewed sense of purpose to never commit that sin ever again because you've just been forgiven of it. And that's what Jesus offers to all of us, regardless of our past or regardless of what it was that we've done. Now, when I talked to Kevin about this lesson earlier this week, he asked, "What's the point of this? What do you want people to remember on Monday when they're getting ready to start their week?" I immediately said, "I'll give you an example of what I don't want." In my hometown congregation, I was giving a lesson one time, and the topic was kind of similar to this one, but it's tweaked a little bit. It was about perception and what people think of Christians and maybe what people might be thinking of Christians based on our actions. I told the story about how I was in the supervisor training class at a previous place of employment, and the class was on implicit bias. And so they were just showing all these words on the screen, and one at a time, and they just had us write down the first thing that popped up in our mind when we saw that word. So they would throw out a word like athlete. What's the first thing that you think of when you see athlete? Or businessman, or single mom, single dad, family of 4, etc. There were probably 20 or 30 words that they threw up on the screen. And then afterwards, they went through each word and just had us shout out the first thing that we had written down. And when it came to a specific word, I remembered I have to remember what people say about this word. And the word was evangelical. And so I wrote down the first 3 responses that people said. And the first 3 things they said were hypocritical, judgmental, and holier than thou. So the point of my lesson that day was, hey, this is what people think of us. So what can we do in our lives to change our perceptions of those around us, maybe both ourselves and as our congregation as a whole. And this is in the middle of central Kansas as well. This isn't anywhere else. Well, afterwards, someone came up to me, and their only comment about my lesson literally was, well, you know those bad words you put up on the screen? That describes other Christians. That doesn't describe us here. And I didn't even know what to say because my only thought was, that lesson just went right over that person's head. Instead of holding up a mirror to their own life and looking at what they could do better or what the congregation could do better, they just categorically dismissed this criticism and said that it didn't even apply to us. So I would ask all of us here today to actually examine how we view others who have sinned, who are still in sin, or who maybe are just going through a tough situation that they caused themselves, and to show them some grace and some empathy. Take that next step and to actually have compassion for them and to help alleviate their pain instead of just telling them to deal with it because it's their own fault that they are in this situation to begin with. David Guzik again says, if we must look at the sins of others, we must be aware that we have also sinned. There is still a place for exposing and rebuking and directly dealing with the sins of others in God's family, but it must always be done with a heart that recognizes itself as a forgiven sinner. And this is the important part. When done right, confronting sin is done more often with tears and a broken heart than with anger and condemnation. Now, part of compassion might be telling someone that what they're doing is wrong, or showing them that their actions have led to their current situation and their suffering. But it's about having the right attitude when you're doing that. Don't come into it appearing to be judgmental and holier than thou because you never did what they would do, what you would never do what they did, because that's hypocritical. All of us have sinned, and all of us have suffered. And so we can all help others through their own sin and their suffering by remembering that fact and having that empathy and actually walking through it with them instead of sitting up in our ivory tower and just yelling instructions at them and getting mad when they don't do what they say, what we tell them to do. So as we think about how we can be more compassionate to others, it should be easier for those of us who have had the experience of having kids. Or maybe you want to picture having a younger sibling or a niece or a nephew that you're close to. As we discussed at the beginning of this lesson, the easiest compassion you'll ever experience is as a parent has compassion for their child. There are very few things your child could ever do that would cause you to stop loving them. You love your child, and all you want in this world is what's best for them, even when they royally screw up, even when they make a really bad or a really stupid decision. And that's how God the Father views us. Again, as a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. How you feel about your child is how God feels about you. Isn't that comforting? Isn't that encouraging to us this morning? That's how Jesus looked at the woman in John chapter 8. He could have condemned her, but instead he showed her grace. He showed her compassion. And that's because in Jesus there is no condemnation. Romans chapter 8, verses 1 through 4 says, "There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Jesus Christ. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit." There is no condemnation in Jesus because he took that condemnation that we deserve upon himself, and he nailed it to the cross with him when he died for our sins. Jesus did not sin, and he didn't deserve the punishment of sin. If there was anyone in that situation that day that could have thrown a stone at that woman, it was Jesus. But instead of condemning her and casting that stone, he took the condemnation upon himself, and he went ahead and he forgave the woman. So maybe you've done some really bad things in your life. Maybe you've made some really poor decisions, and maybe it's been a lot of them, and you've been suffering ever since. And even if it's your own fault, forgiveness is still available for you today. Earlier we pictured being caught in our worst moment and picturing the shame and the humiliation that comes with that. But we also pictured the relief and the joy that would come with forgiveness of the action when Jesus said, "I don't condemn you, now go and sin no more." So if you want to feel that relief and that forgiveness, if you want to feel the compassion that God the Father has for you, then now is your opportunity to experience that through baptism, through Jesus' death and resurrection. If you want to be baptized or have any other need, please come forward now as we stand and as we sing.